Hello everybody and welcome back to the Norries podcast. As always, I am joined by my good friend.
Hi everyone.
Timmy Long. My cousin Rowan is on the decks. Hi Rowan.
Hi Rowan.
This week we have a probation officer. You're not a senior probation officer, you're the regional manager for the southern region.
That's right, yeah.
For the people that don't know you, who are you and where are you from?
My name is Margaret Griffin and I was born in and raised and still live in Tipperary.
So do you commute to Cork?
I don't come to Cork every day because the region that I cover is Limerick, Clare, Kerry and Cork. So I have offices in both Limerick and in Cork. So I generally, pre-COVID would have come to Cork 2 days a week. And what I'm doing at the moment is coming 1 day a week to Cork and go to Limerick 1 day and generally work from home then for the other 3.
You never mentioned Waterford and Kerry. Is Waterford the east?
No, that's. I'm actually the regional manager for the southwest, and Waterford is in the southeast.
Okay.
And Tipperary is actually in the southeast as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously, to get into that position, you had to have a lot of experience. How long were you probation? Are you in the probation service?
I joined the probation service on the 21st of June, 1982. So this June I'll be 39 years in the probation service.
Congratulations, I wasn't even born.
I was thinking that was a possibility.
Just a year over.
That was a possibility.
It was a year over. I was born in 1981,
Okay.
so it was just a year over.
Yeah.
I was born in 85.
Okay.
Yeah. And what age were you when you went into the probation service?
I was 22.
So did you come from university?
No, I suppose I joined the probation service the year after I finished university. And between finishing university and joining the probation service, I worked as a childcare worker with a family in Limerick. So,
Okay.
yeah.
That's very good. And what way was I suppose me and Timmy might know more than the average person on the probation service. But for somebody that has no idea what probation service is, can you give us a kind of an overview of the function of the probation service?
I can, I hope. If I can't, I'm in trouble anyway.
You are.
After 39 years, if I don't know what we're doing. I suppose the probation service works in prisons, in all of the prisons in the state, and provides a service there. But most of the work of the probation service is in the community. And we accept referrals from the courts and complete assessment reports for the court, which the court then uses to inform their sentencing decisions. Very often at the end of that, somebody is placed either directly on probation at their sentencing hearing. But since 2006, there is a provision for what we call a dual order, where somebody gets a period of custody followed by a period of post-release supervision. So there are two different kinds of orders, but a lot of our work is done in the community. We start off with whoever we're working with at whatever stage of the process we kind of engage with them with doing an initial assessment. And that initial assessment is about, working with the person to establish what kind of factors in their life, what's going on in their life that contributes to them getting into trouble. And then we work with them throughout their period on probation supervision to address whatever those issues are, whether they're around use of leisure time, peer associations, some of their own kind of attitudes and beliefs about themselves and about their place in the world and their communities. Addiction and substance misuse is obviously very high up there as well, because that's a very regular issue that people becoming before the courts would experience.
When myself and Timmy was in very early recovery, Timmy was just after getting out after doing a few years, and I was doing community service. Timmy was on community return scheme. What did you make of the community supervision element of the sentence, Timmy? Do you think it benefited you?
Definitely kept me in track, you know, because when you come out of prison, or when you're in early recovery, you still have some behaviours that don't benefit you. So the probation service just kind of kept me in line a little bit with appointments and keeping me going to the community service, which was up in the IDP at the time. No, it definitely helped. It definitely helped. I had a question there as well. No, it's not relating this. How young are the people, the people that you work with? Like, is it teenagers? Do you work with young children as well?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do have a branch of the probation service called Young Persons Probation, and there are dedicated teams for young persons probation in Limerick, Cork and Dublin, and then probation officers in different teams around the country then would also work with young people. But I suppose we have dedicated teams where there's kind of a critical population of young people, and they'd be generally the kind of the bigger cities. So like we I suppose the age of criminal responsibility is 13, I think. So there's the potential for somebody that young to come before the courts. But I think, with all the kind of Garda diversion projects and the Garda diversion initiatives and processes that are in place, generally speaking, 15 or 16 would be the youngest that we'd be working with now. That wasn't always the case. When I joined the probation service in 82, the age of criminal responsibility at that stage was 7. And I do remember, there was a children's court on a Saturday in Limerick, and they were very young, children in the courts at that point.
Were these kids then, if they were convicted, were they sent to homes then, or were they put into homes, like if they were after committing a crime back then?
I suppose it was a bit more complicated than that. It depended on their circumstances and other things that were going on in their lives. Like if there was, a robust and good support structure for them in their homes, that was obviously the best place for them, and they stayed within their homes. But some of them
they needed to be put into safer. I remember my earliest interaction with probation services was I was 15, and they were very, very helpful. They really helped me at the time to get into a treatment centre down in Clonakilty, and there was a lovely man helped me as well. I won't mention his name now because but he was very, very helpful. And going back to what you were saying there about even the supervision, I had some fantastic people working with me inside the office in Cork. They were very helpful. When they see me, like their initial contact with everybody, they have to look at them and judge them and by their actions and turning up to meetings and see, are they really sincere about their recovery or doing well in society or whatever it may be. And I suppose when they did find me somebody that was really, really trying to turn my life around, they really gave me a little bit more leeway. And it really benefited me in the end. I met some fantastic people in there. And
I remember a lot of young fellas, not a lot of young fellas, but quite a few young people generally, young adults would, if they're after being in trouble for the first time, and because myself and Timmy now are known as people as being through this, they kind of come for advice, I'm on probation, what's it going to be? And I said, it's like this said, you write that report yourself by your behaviour. So like the probation officer won't write anything. He's not going to write, or he or she is not going to write anything just for the sake of it. If you're turning up for your appointments, that will be noted. If you're not turning up for your appointments, that will too be noted. If you want a favourable probation report, you make sure you turn up for your appointments, you do what you're supposed to be doing, and if that happens, you don't worry about anything else. But people have this. Some people maybe that don't know, I'm on probation, the probation officer is going to write this bad report. The probation officer will not write that report unless you give him a load of ammunition to do that, So would that be a fair enough thing to say?
Oh, I think it is absolutely fair enough to say. like, we would have no interest in writing a bad report. You know, if anything, we're looking for the positives and we're looking for the hooks towards desistance and towards progression and towards, you know, a more positive future. Because I suppose one of the things that we would see, both from kind of research and also from our own experience, that involvement in the criminal justice system can be really life limiting for people. You know, it can be limiting in terms of employment prospects, in terms of travel, in terms of, you know, missing out on family. You know, I've sat with loads of men down through the years who weren't at home when the first tooth came up, who weren't at home when the first step was taken, who didn't hear the first word, you know, from their child. So they you know, they're missing out an awful lot, you know, in that context. So, you know, we would be looking, as I said, for the positive, looking for the hooks, and see it as part of our role, not only to look for them that are there, but also to create kind of an enabling environment where that desire, you know, towards change and towards desistance can be nurtured and encouraged and supported as well.
Do you know, back in the early days, like, would have been probation and welfare.
Yes.
And as things moved on, the kind of welfare was taken from probation. What was that like for a probation officer? What was that transition like? Did you feel that maybe some of the human side of your work was outsourced to community projects, or can you explain maybe what it meant for you?
I think one of the things that, one of the effects of it, and there was, you know, a lot of discussion and debate within the service when that change took place. And I think I suppose it, you know, forced a level of introspection where we had to kind of look at it, you know, what it is we're doing and how we're doing it. And you know, a lot of probation officers are social workers. And the challenge in dropping the welfare part of the title was about defining what it is a social worker does in a criminal justice context. You know, what is, why do we engage with people? What is our focus? What is our job in terms of engaging with people as probation officers? And I think that, you know, while it was difficult, you know, for some people at the time, I think it has enabled us to have a very different conversation about what it is we do. What does a criminal justice social worker do? You know, what do we do to support desistance from offending, to enable desistance from offending in some instances? What is it that we do with somebody within the privacy of the probation office that supports them to address the issues that cause their offending? Because that's ultimately why we're in people's lives. You know, we're in people's lives, and it's at a cost as well. I mean, being on probation isn't cost-free for the probationer. You know, somebody has to make the effort of getting up, you know, keeping appointments, receiving probation officers in their home, talking about sometimes, you know, quite personal and intimate parts of their lives. It's not cost neutral. So it's about, you know, how can we make the best use of that time to give the person the best chance of not being back before the courts or not being back on probation at points in the future.
So for somebody that's on a probation order, generally it's a set amount of time. It's like a sentence to serve in the community. So for the duration of that sentence, they will engage with the probation officer. And please God, they get to the end of that and go back to the judge, and the judge says, you've done well, blah, blah, blah. Then you're finished with that person. And then they go on to services in the community if they so wish.
Absolutely.
But that's a voluntary aspect.
Absolutely.
But when you're engaged with the probation service, it's involuntary.
It is involuntary.
How do you deal with somebody that has been given a probation order, but maybe they're not ready for it, or they see it as it's not prison, so it's a win, but maybe they don't want to engage? Like, how do you motivate somebody maybe that's not ready, Or
By telling them they're going to prison if they don't, basically, really, is it?
Yeah.
That's by the judge. Like
Yeah.
Judge Ury says, if you don't interact with probation services, you'll get your suspended sentence.
Yeah.
That's my understanding of it.
I suppose I just want to correct one thing that you said there, James. Very often, when somebody is placed on probation, their case isn't subsequently reviewed by the court.
Okay.
So somebody could get a 12-month probation order. They meet their probation officer for the duration, and at the end of it, they shake hands.
They don't have to go back to
and
the
they don't
judge.
have to go back before the courts. So, sometimes they do if the court builds in a review, but that's actually rarer than the other situation where they just do their
So they might only have to go back to court if the probation officer flags something that maybe, like, let's say if I get a probation order off the judge and you're my probation officer, but I'm not playing ball with you and missing appointments and turning up under the influence, do you then have to go to the judge, or can you, like, how does that work? What's the word for sending somebody to prison? I know there's a kind of a term where, like, if you have to get somebody committed to prison because they're not sticking to their band, what's that process?
I suppose, again, just a slight correction on that.
Yeah.
Probation isn't an alternative to prison. So it isn't inevitable that if we bring breach proceedings because somebody isn't cooperating, that they end up in prison. That's not inevitable. Community service, which is another scheme, or that is a direct alternative to custody. So it's a higher tariff. So there's the likelihood that if somebody doesn't do their community work, that they're brought back to court, there's a possibility that they will go to prison in that context. They don't always go because the judge sometimes suspends the sentence, or, but community service is a direct alternative to custody, whereas probation supervision isn't. So being breach proceedings doesn't inevitably lead to a prison sentence. So the process is that we swear out the information in court, indicating how somebody breached their conditions. A summons is issued, a summons is served, the person comes before the court, the probation officer presents the evidence of the breach, and the court then makes a decision about the outcome. And I suppose it's interesting that we're talking about breaches, because a small enough minority of probation supervision cases end in breach. Most, probably around 80% of probation orders end in successful outcomes. Does that always mean that somebody is well on the road to a crime-free life, or well on their desistance journey? It doesn't always mean that, but they have successfully managed the period of supervision. They may be back before the courts, at a later point, but.
Thanks for clearing that, because I always thought like that if you didn't play ball with the probation officer, the alternative was prison, but it's not always the case.
No, not always the case.
It goes back to the judge.
It goes back to the judge, and the judge adjudicates on that. Then we do, and very often the judge would say to us, would you give him another chance?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you can get probation order, and if it's maybe an early offence, or you're young, or just mitigating, so you could avoid conviction altogether.
Well, actually, if you're placed on probation supervision in the district court, that doesn't carry conviction.
Yeah.
The Act, the 1907 Act, is constructed in such a way that people placed on probation in the district court don't acquire a conviction. The facts have to be proved, which either means that somebody pleads guilty, or they're kind of, the fact it's accepted that they are guilty, but they're not. The court doesn't then convict them if they're placed on supervision.
It's a very difficult job to be a probation officer, from what I gather. you really get to know the people that you're working with in their office. They tell you their stories, and when they tell you their stories, you'll get an understanding of why they are addicts or alcoholics, or why they're so violent, you know, because of your own backgrounds with, you know, so like when you see somebody and you know that they're quite harmless, but they have committed a crime, and they're not probably turning up for their probation meetings and stuff like that, and then you have to go back to a judge and say, no, Your Honour, you have to be honest as well. He's not turning up for his meetings, you know, they're not giving themselves much of a chance, really, but you know that they're actually a good person. It must be very, very difficult to know that, right, this person's probably going to go to prison now, but there's nothing I can do. I have to do my job.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds like a really difficult job, an emotional job, where if you get connected to somebody and they're not doing their thing.
It's like if you're working with people, like even, you know, mentoring somebody in the community, and you want what's best for them, but sometimes they're just not ready, and they'll fall and they'll fall. And when, like, is it fair to say like that, a probation officer gets into the job because he wants to help people, you know? The probation officer wants to help this person that's in the criminal justice system. So obviously you're going to build a connection, but sometimes a lot of the time it mightn't work out the way you want it to work out, you know what I mean? So it's just a hard part of the job.
I think, I do think that one of the things that's really important is that, you know, when we start working with somebody, that we need to be really clear with them about who we are, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. So that we're very explicit about what's expected of them in terms of their probation supervision as well. And there are what we call negotiables and non-negotiables. So it's really important that we're saying to them, you know, the non-negotiables are that you keep appointments, you know, that you have to keep appointments. If there are specific conditions attached to your order in terms of attendance at treatment, you know, that's something that you have to do as well. You know, then, you know, within that, you know, within the confines of the room, there are some negotiables in terms of, you know, where do we start and how do we kind of go on this journey together while you're on supervision. You know, so within that, then, as I said, there are some negotiables. And I suppose one of the things that we would, you know, try and do, we obviously have an objective. Our objective in working with somebody is to increase the chances of them not committing further criminal offences. That, you know, that's very explicit and that's very clear. But we also, you know, have that desire to, you know, help them to improve their lives if that's, you know, what they're choosing to do. So that might be about connecting them with other services in their community that would be of assistance to them, whether that's kind of training opportunities or leisure opportunities or, you know, whatever, or counselling. Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
That's counselling is, for me, the number one thing, like, that somebody should be getting. With counselling, like, I see the psychotherapists and different forms of counsellors myself for 6 years in my own recovery, and I found it a massive benefit in me getting to where I am now. You know, opening up and starting to talk about some of the things that I wouldn't have been able to talk about, the stuff that was in my head, stuff that I would have drank on and drugged on and all these different things, you know. So do you think there's enough of effort going into getting and enough counselling for the people that are on probation and that need your service, basically?
I suppose not everybody is ready for counselling either, you know, and I think it's really important that you actually have no choice but to work at somebody's pace. Do you know what I mean? If you're ahead of the person that you're working with, you've kind of lost them. So, you know, so you have to meet them where they're at and hopefully move along a progressive journey with them while they're on supervision. Do I think there's enough? No, I don't. I don't think. I think, you know, counselling can be hard to access for people. And And it can be hard for people to sustain then, even if they do get the opportunity, because it's a very painful journey, you know, in terms of that kind of introspection and, you know, opening up kind of old traumas and looking at childhood issues or whatever, you know, it is a difficult journey. So I suppose, you know, I don't think there's enough opportunity to do it, but I would also recognise that, you know, a lot of the people that we work with aren't able or ready to go there at that particular point where we're engaging with them.
Sorry.
You're grand.
Would you say, and I don't want to put you on the spot now, and I know you're still working actively in the probation service, but would you say the probation service is well resourced? And if a probation officer has a client, what would you call the person, a client?
Yeah.
If the probation officer has a client and this client wants to do this, that and the other, counselling, therapy, all these things, has the probation officer got the resources to help fund that or powers to make that happen? Or does the probation officer still bound by the waiting list everybody else is?
A lot of the time we are bound by the same waiting list that everybody else is. I suppose one of the things that a lot of funding from the probation service goes into what we would call community-based organisations. So we do have a network of community-based organisations around the country.
Like the Cork Alliance.
Like the Cork Alliance, like Churchfield, like PALS in Limerick. There's upwards of 60 community-based organisations around the country.
The YES project, is that probation service?
Yes.
Yeah, it's over in Tremor Road. Yes. Good answer.
Right answer. Yeah. So we would have access to, you know, counselling and supports through those organisations as well, which probably might work to the advantage of somebody who's on supervision. But I think one of the other things, and I think this is kind of a very highly valued aspect of being on probation, because the probation service funds a number of addiction treatment centres, there is the facility for somebody on probation to get access to, you know, either residential or community-based
that's very good
supports around addiction. And I have to say, in my experience, and talking to people that I've worked with down through the years, that is something that is very highly valued by them, because it kind of greases the wheels and makes access to the service that bit easier for them. Yeah.
How are the probation services coping at the moment with the amount of people that probably have community service and they can't do it over COVID-19?
Yeah.
How are you actually keeping up with the amount of cases? Because courts are still open, and I can imagine the workload that you probably have on top of your desks of people, but nobody can go and do community service at the moment. So you probably have a backlog of maybe 12 months. What's the way you're going to be able to do something like that?
It's a difficult challenge. Like community service, there's been kind of some sites open at different times, you know, depending on what level of restriction we're at in terms of COVID-19 over the past 12 months. Now it's just over 12 months. But, you know, during level 5 restrictions, our sites are closed. You know, we can't facilitate safely operating community service at the minute. There is, some work has gone online. And there are a number of kind of initiatives in different parts of the country for some kind of group work online. The community service so that would be around preparing for employment, say a preparing for employment course, or a course around addiction or addiction and offending, or that type of thing. Some of that is available online, and some self-development work as well. Some of the community based projects have been very active and very helpful in terms of engaging with people who are on community service, and in trying to get down their hours. But there is a backlog, there is a challenge. We're very acutely aware of it, and we're currently putting proposals together to address the backlog.
It's like it's in every business.
It
really.
is, yeah.
It's everybody's going to have to deal with the exact same things yourselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hospitals and
I know.
Yeah. I suppose there is. There has been a slowdown of referrals, though, it has to be said. Like, the courts aren't operating at the same level, obviously, as they were prior to COVID-19, and particularly, during level 5 restrictions. So we wouldn't have the same kind of volume of referrals as we would ordinarily have in a non-COVID year, as you'd expect. So that does provide, a little bit of space.
That's also so with this. And what I got out of prison, I got out in the incentive unit, the scheme.
Community returns.
The community return, yeah.
So there's nobody getting out on a community return. So at the moment, is there?
No, they are. Yeah.
Or are they still getting out?
They are still getting out on community
that's
return.
good because
Oh no, that
That's good.
Yeah.
It's nice. It's nice to hear.
They just have to do their community work on Zoom.
Doing their community work.
But like you said, courses there. If they're courses that are going to benefit them, through education or even personal development and personal growth, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and there is the provision, within community service.
Yeah.
It's called integrated community service. Like, when community service started, it was generally physical labour that people did one way or another, whether it was kind of work in graveyards or GAA clubs or schools or
the grounds of
hospitals or the working with the St. Vincent de Paul or whatever. It was generally kind of physical work. But there is the provision now for what we call integrated community service, where a certain percentage of the hours are allotted to self-improvement initiatives, whether that is attendance at addiction course, not courses, but, addiction services or self-development courses or, addressing or counselling or addressing whatever issues are there for the individual client. And it is very individualised. I suppose that's one of the things that I really want to say. I mean, we work very hard to provide a consistent service around the country, so that if I'm on probation in Donegal or if I'm in probation in Cork, I'm getting the same kind of quality service. And that kind of consistency of quality is really important to us. But one of the things that's also really important to us is that it is very individualised. So I might be, somebody might be accessing the service in Donegal, somebody might be accessing it in Cork, and they're not getting the same service because they don't need the exact same service. They need whatever engagement they have with a probation officer to be individualised to them and their particular needs. And somebody's needs in Donegal might be very different from somebody's needs in Cork. But they still deserve the same consistency of service and the same quality of service. If you understand the distinction between that I'm trying to make.
Do you know when you started out? I'm going to ask you about some of the people that you might meet on your job, right? So do you know when you started out, you work, like, probation service can have any range of an offence, including sexual offences, and some of the more heinous or maybe more frowned upon offences. You have to work with all these people. Did you find it hard initially to separate the person from the offence? Like, let's say if you're a young social worker working in probation service and somebody's come in and they've killed a child or molested their child, did you find that difficult working with that person? Or was it something that
personally, I didn't. I would understand how some people could, but personally, I didn't. And I'm a bit of a storyteller myself. And I like to hear stories. And I think I've never worked with anybody who, when they begin to tell you who they are and tell you about their life journey and tell you about the things that they've encountered or tell you about some of the trauma that they've experienced, I've never worked with anybody who I haven't been able to see their humanity. You know, so no matter how heinous the crime, or no matter, you know, what kind of public scorn is landed on them, I think once you sit down opposite somebody and you look them in the eye and you hear their story and you connect to their story at a human level, I think you can judge their behaviour, and we do judge their behaviour, but I think that, you know, we are able to make that distinction between the person and the thing that they've done.
Yeah, I think it's an important coping skill for a probation officer to be able to do that, because you have to work with that person. And, you know, I know, like, it's better for somebody like that to be engaged with the probation service, because, you know, they're helped to move out of that type of behaviour. It's better than just being released and not having that support, you know. So I understand the benefits of having them engaged. But in practical terms then, is it hard to, if you're working with somebody, maybe, because that is probably the most frowned upon offence, sexual offences, like in terms of if they want to go to college, they want to get to counselling, and all these other things that maybe a regular client would want to do, is it more difficult just to keep their identities protected, and to keep them safe? Like, if I know a lot of sexual offenders end up in homelessness because it's very hard to place them in communities. You know, is that a tough part?
That is a challenge, and I suppose kind of one of the ironies of it is that, you know, knowing where a sex offender is living, you know, them being known in the community that they're living is actually a protective factor. You know, it's when you push people underground and you push people away and you other people, they become more risky in those circumstances. So there is, you know, there is a kind of a struggle, you know, in relation to that.
And honestly, no. Do you know, when you're working as a probation officer, do you know, you're working with a team, is there some people they like to work with a certain type of offender, or is that they won't work with a certain type, or in your experience, people will work with whoever is there?
Yes, I think you know, there is an expectation that people will work with whoever is there, and we do, like we now there are, you know, some areas where you need particular training, like to work with sex offenders or to work with perpetrators of domestic violence. You need to be trained in the risk assessment instruments that we use with those two categories of offenders. So you need to have that training, and if you don't have that training, you can't work with those people. But that's different to somebody saying, "Oh, I don't work with X type of offender or Y type of offender."
That would be a very unprofessional thing to do anyway.
But I suppose when as you said, you like sitting down listening to their story. I suppose when you're listening to their story, they're starting from the beginning of their story, and their story could start off with them being sexually abused as a child, or some case like that, and they would have thought it was the norm or something like that. I don't know how it works, but and you're listening to that then, and you're having, like, you're listening to this person, adult, talking, and the child has actually been in these traumatic experiences. I suppose you're actually getting a bit of compassion and empathy for this child, and you're looking then, and with your own academic education, you're able to understand a little bit more why this person did turn out the way they did. You know, and it kind of, it's like putting two and two together. It makes sense then why they probably did commit these crimes, and you know, and I suppose you do get a bit of empathy and compassion. I know the crimes that are committed are serious, and they're not right. But like,
I'd say you could even have that kind of perspective on every offence, really. Like,
it's like every offence. It's just some. Listen, in this country, sex anyway in general, like it's when people start talking about it, shame automatically comes to the forefront of the emotions, and feelings. So it's just normal. But when we go into something like that, especially when we have the background we have with everything that went on in this country in the last 20 years that came out, it even gets a little bit worse, and it's still coming out, and it's just one of those topics that it just kind of upsets everybody when people do talk about it. It brings up the surface, their own shame and their own stuff, what they have done in their own past and stuff like that.
It's a pure taboo, and they're the boogeymen. But the probation officer is the one that has to work with that person, and it has to be done at the same time. As you said, it's better to have them engaged in the services and working with them than them going underground.
Absolutely.
Because they're at a high risk.
Absolutely. But, and I suppose, we do take our responsibilities very seriously when it, comes to working with people who have the potential and the propensity to harm others. We take that responsibility very seriously. And that's why it's really important, as I said earlier, that we explain exactly who we are and what we're doing and why we're doing it. And also, the consequences of not working with us or not complying with us. That, that people know from the very get-go, if I don't play ball here, I could end up back in court. And, we do take that responsibility to public safety very seriously as well, that if somebody has that propensity or that potential to harm other people, we would take action on it. We would bring stuff back to court. And it might sound harsh, but that wouldn't cost me. If I thought somebody was going to harm somebody else, it wouldn't cost me to bring them back to court. Not at all. It's my job.
It's your job to protect people in society, really, from people that have committed crimes, violence, and So it's actually your job. You're like just underneath the guards, really. And
or maybe above.
It depends.
Certain guards, certain probation officers. But like, you have statutory powers, and you can breach, as we were saying earlier, and that was the word I was trying to think of. You can breach somebody, meaning you have the statutory power to get somebody put into prison if you feel they're a danger to themselves or others.
We don't have the statutory power to get somebody into prison. We have the statutory power to bring somebody back before the court.
Or recommendation.
And the court we wouldn't even necessarily make a recommendation.
You have an objective report based on the experiences
we'd be saying,
order.
This person hasn't complied in this way, this way, this way, and this way. They're not complying with the conditions of their order. We're bringing it back to the court, and the court then, as I said, adjudicates on it and decides what the next step is. Sometimes they'll say to us, we'll give them another chance. Sometimes they'll impose another sanction, and other times then they will send them into prison.
A probation officer said to me one day that they loved working with Section 15A offenders. Section 15A being sale and supply of drugs. Because Section 15A offenders generally have their heads screwed on. They're involved in, illicit enterprise, and they just got caught, and they generally mightn't have any mad addictions or madness going on in their life, and they're probably easy to work with while they're on finishing their sentence in the communities, So I don't know, have you any comment on that? Or is there an offender that's more, like, I suppose when you, like, first of all, how the offenders or the clients divvied out amongst probation officers? Is there a group of probation officers work with this type of offender?
No.
So
it's mostly geography, actually.
Okay.
So like the two supervision teams in Cork, it's very simple. There's a Cork North team and there's a Cork South team. And the Cork North team would cover the north side of the city and the north side of the county, and stretching into some of the east of the county. And the Cork South team would cover the south side of the city, the south side of the county, stretching out west. So it is geography, and it is who has space on their caseload. So it isn't that Margaret works with all Section 15As or it isn't like that. So it is about who has space on the caseload, and it's allocated then mostly kind of on the basis of geography.
from the perspective of a probation officer, what do you think are the biggest barriers to reintegration for people like myself and Timmy, or people that you work with?
Opportunities, I suppose. That it can be really hard to create or link people to opportunities. Sometimes having a criminal conviction is a barrier to employment. It can be a barrier to accommodation. It can be a barrier to travel. It can be, even if it isn't a legal barrier to some opportunities, it can be a practical barrier in that, there might be groups who wouldn't choose to have somebody with a criminal conviction join their group and be part of their group, whether it's a kind of mountain walking group or whatever. Do you know what I mean? And so that kind of, there can be exclusion, a bit more subtle exclusion, in that type of group. So I think that, that can be a barrier. I think sometimes people can limit themselves as well. And I'm, that's not about blaming the individual or saying, this is your fault that you're in this situation. But I suppose one of the things that can be hard for people to sustain is a sense of hope. A hope that, and a belief that things can get better and will get better. And if you haven't hope, and if you haven't the kind of vision for a better future for yourself and your family, you can be kind of self-limiting in that regard. But I suppose opportunities would be the biggest kind of thing. And I suppose one of the things that, I was out of Limerick. I worked in Limerick for most of my kind of young probation life. And I was out of Limerick for a couple of years. And when I went back, one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of the lads who would have been in the court every week, that they had stopped offending, they'd stopped going to court, but there was no dividend for them. Do you know what I mean? They were. I used to call them, not call them, but I used to think of them as kind of ghost-like, walking around their community, minding their kids, involved with their kids, which was hugely positive, but not really getting any bounce from having stopped offending. And I think that must be really, really hard for somebody to sustain.
I spoke about this with somebody recently in the context of people in recovery, which is very similar. Desistance and recovery, very similar. You have the freedom of prison, freedom of addiction, but freedom of is no good if you haven't got the freedom to. And the freedom to is what you're talking about. They're not involved in the criminal justice system. They don't have the freedom to have the nice job or the car or the partner. They're still... And there's people in recovery too, their freedom of addiction, freedom of all that, but their lives are stagnated, and the freedom of is no good without the freedom to. And that's a kind of a philosophy, Eric Fromm book I was reading there. He was touching on that, and it's good because I was only speaking about this recently enough, and it's a sad situation to be in, You're broken away from you've got out of that cycle of courts and prison and probation, you've got out of that cycle of addiction, but you haven't got any dividend, as you said.
And I suppose one of the things about that is that, like one of the factors that's kind of scores very highly in why people get involved in offending is their peer associations, who it is they're hanging around with, who they're spending their time with, who they're drinking with, where they're drinking, that type of thing. And, for somebody who's breaking away, part of that might be leaving their group of friends behind, and that's and sometimes it's leaving their family behind, so that's a really lonely place to be.
Leaving your whole identity behind. Did you want to come in there then?
Let me...
Sorry, I thought you wanted to come in there.
No, I did. There was something alright, but what was it? You were speaking about just people not having choices.
Yeah.
And maybe I was just thinking in my own head, when somebody really reaches somebody that has lived a life of crime and addiction, whatever, when they do come into recovery, there's always that feeling of they're not good enough, like imposter syndrome, and you're never going to be good enough, and there's always that feeling that something else is going to come up and bite you in the back or something like that. You know, we all have that, you know, because we're so used to who's at the door or it's the guards, you know. We're so used to that. But I suppose if somebody like some guy now in Limerick or Cork or whatever, and he's out of prison, I suppose the best thing for somebody like that to be working on really is themselves, for them to actually reach inside themselves, where they can find that lost little boy that got into the trouble because of stuff that was going on at home or stuff that was going on out the street, or became an addict because he wasn't able to handle his emotions, you know. And just for him to really be involved in courses and self-help groups and stuff like that with other men that are the same as them, in groups, you know, where they can really start loving themselves, because that's a massive thing for me, was trying to find a little bit of love to be able for myself in life, you know. That's what we really need. We need groups. It's like AA, and then an addict stops using drugs when they feel that they have something in common and they can relate to a guy that's sitting across the way from them. They don't feel alienated anymore, you know, because they're caught up in their head. Now they have people the exact same as them they can talk to. Maybe if we had something similar to that with people that were in prison and feel the same way, and their groups, and there's a bit of counselling and stuff, that's where I see the change.
It goes back to that thing we were talking about off camera, having agency, giving somebody agency, as in the ability to actually, you know, not rely on the social welfare, not rely on, you know, the state. Like, the social welfare was very good to me, you know, down through the years, education, being on job seekers, being on backed education, all these things. And there was a fierce anxiety about moving away from that into full-time employment. Do you know, like you're on your own type of thing, you know. A lot of people, especially, I think, people on the disability, they find it very hard to let go of it. And as secure as the disability is, it's very limiting as well, you know, and it can keep people they're not as bad as they were, but they're never going to reach the potential. Do you know, and do you find that in your...
I think that is... and I'm smiling as you're saying that, because, you know, I've had conversations with women especially who'd say, and will I lose my medical card? You mean I'll lose my medical? And that fear of taking that step, and as you say, kind of being on your own, and that kind of self-reliance can be very scary for people. But I do think, you know, that's where kind of education can come in. That's where supports can come in. That's where having the hope and having the ambition. And I'm very interested in what you're saying about that kind of imposter syndrome, Tim, because I think that is something that is very, very real for people. And sometimes they see that reflected back on them from other people as well. Do you know what I mean? That I suppose one of the things that that I would always say to the people that I worked with when I did kind of direct client work is, you know, I don't define you by the worst thing that you've ever done. And I would really invite you not to define yourself by the worst thing that you've ever done. And I think, you know, and I suppose one of the things that I kind of started doing in the last 10 years of kind of that direct practice was saying to people, okay, so I'm here because I'm a probation officer and you've committed offences and you've been before the courts, and we need to talk about all of that, and we will talk about all of that. But I'd always, particularly at the first time that I'd meet them, I'd always say to them, tell me something about yourself that you're proud of, or tell me about something about yourself that you're passionate about. And I have been bowled over by the things that people reveal about themselves when they tell that story. Like, I remember one fella telling me that he was a chess champion when he was in school. I remember another fella, the most unlikely person you could imagine. And I'm smiling as I'm saying that now. He was a fellow I was really fond of, but he had a ferocious interest in local history. He was passionate about local history. And if I was guessing for a million years about what he was passionate about, local history would have been it would be way down the list. It wouldn't even have featured in it. And I remember another time talking to a woman who was in a really depressive state. She was really, really down. And I even found as I was talking to her that I was having to watch myself so that I didn't follow her down, into where she was. And I remember at the end of it saying to her, can you tell me something that you love? And she was in prison, but she had 2 little dogs that she absolutely adored. And I'll never forget how her face just completely changed. And she brightened up and she smiled and she became animated as she spoke about these 2 little dogs. Now, again, if you don't ask that question, that's a part of that person's story that you never get to hear. So I do think, while there has to be the focus on the behaviour that brings somebody before the court and brings them to probation, but that bit of a more holistic look at who they are, so that you're not defining them by the worst thing that they've done, and they're not defining themselves in that way either. I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's very, very true. But the other side of it is, the reality of it is, you are defined by the stuff that you do. Yeah. In a lot of cases, particularly looking for jobs, you're defined by the worst stuff you do, not the stuff that you've done. Now, we already spoke about it last week in a podcast with Damien Quinn. You're actually defined by all the worst stuff.
Yeah.
And that might have happened 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But they never read out the stuff you've done in between.
Yeah.
All the changes, all the positive stuff you've done, all the people you've helped, even the education process you went through yourself, that's never mentioned in a job interview or any form of interview. It's the only thing that is mentioned is, he robbed this person, he robbed that house, So that's something we definitely need to look at.
One of the workarounds, we spoke about that last week with Damien, who would have a similar story to ourselves. Like when you're doing a Garda vetting, the vetting arrives in the post or by email with no context attached. It's just dates and offences and court numbers and judges or whatever. There's no context to that. And something we were talking about was, maybe if there's a reasonable amount of time has passed, this person has done reasonable amount of work in terms of therapy, personal development, education, courses, employment, whatever, should it come with a maybe a notice from a Garda or a probation officer or a solicitor or somebody in the public service anyway, like a certificate of desistance or something, certificate of this, so that this person has done this, but I'm regional manager for the probation service. No, this client is blah blah blah, and this person is zero risk or very low risk. Would you back something like that?
Yes. Yeah.
I think that would carry a lot of weight.
No, I would back it, but I do think that's where the kind of honesty piece comes in as well. Where I would certainly, be prepared to say honestly if I felt somebody was low risk. But if I didn't, if somebody came to me then and said, I need you to sign this, Margaret, I'd be saying, you must be kidding.
The idea I have in my head now is this would be done all anonymously. With the vetting bureau. The vetting bureau would do the background check. So along with this, let's say if you're looking at James Leonard and all James's offences comes up with court dates. Yeah. There'd be a report of some sort, on the database. There'd be a report to say the progression or his engagement services done through the years, everything he's done in the meantime. So then when the employer gets the vetting, there's something attached, like a certificate of desistance. There's something worded no better than that.
You're looking at maybe a separate organisation to the vetting committee that would go into the background of the stuff that has been done after, and they'd get searched from, say, a college. If a college was you were after attending a college, and there was proof that you got a degree, or you attended psychotherapy for 4 years, you got a letter from a psychotherapist saying, he attended for 4 years, 48 weeks of the year, he's after coming on so well, and the psychologist and our psychotherapist is after, he's on some board or whatever, all that kind of stuff. That would be very, very, very good in showing how far somebody has came. You know?
Because it's not me and Timmy's words then. You've somebody in a position of power and respect that's vouching for you. Do you know?
I know.
Are we thinking in the clouds? Are we thinking 50 years down the line?
You might be.
You know?
You might be.
You know?
I do think that some kind of systematic approach to the barriers to progress, have to be considered. I absolutely agree with you on that. And I do think, there's a responsibility in us as a society, if we're committed to the idea of second chances, and if we're committed to the belief that people can and do change, well, then we have to put our money where our mouth is, really, in terms of that. No, I do agree with that.
That has to eventually lead to somebody that has been through the criminal justice system, prison, that has come through all that and got an education. It's up to the probation service to employ that person eventually, if they're the right person for the job, and only if they're the right person for the job. But for the probation service, really to kind of lead by example, I suppose. And you don't have to comment on this now, Law. Like, I'm just making a statement. I'm just making a statement.
That's fine.
But it's up to the probation service. It's up to the services that know more about us than most organisations. Journeys of desistance, recovery, pathways into offending behaviour, childhood traumas, adverse childhood experiences, probation and probation-funded projects, and that whole carceral network of projects know most than lay organisations in private industries especially. So it's really up to those organisations to lead by example, and I can't wait for a probation officer with a colourful background like Alan Weaver in Scotland, who we spoke about off camera, because I'm sure they'd make a great probation officer. So we probably have a bit to go, but I think we're in the right direction. But I think as well, we're talking about the systematic part of the vetting process. I think there's also, like, we could be barking up the wrong tree altogether, and maybe it's actually down to the employer to just think that not everybody grows up in a privileged background, or not everybody, like, we can't hold everybody to the same morals when we're born in different contexts. We're not all born at the same start point, and what might, like, if you're from a certain community where picking up a conviction might be a total taboo, whereas in this community it's the norm. But we're expected to meet your morals, but we don't have your resources, or you don't have our challenges. Do you know that? Do you know what I'm trying to say? So
I know exactly what you're trying to say.
There's an emphasis on the employer to actually get a bit real as well, you know what I mean? And see that people have the capacity to change. And I think, the response that I got from the Tommy Turner show, the response that we get and Timmy got from doing this podcast, is that people are actually willing to say, do you know what? Fucking fair play to them. They've done that, but they're doing what they can today. So I think that we are moving in the right direction.
And I remember kind of, again, when I worked in Limerick, and when we were setting up the PALS project in Limerick, talking to employers and local employers in particular. And when I say local employers now, I mean born and bred Limerick employers. And some of them were saying, if he has the right skills, if he has the right knowledge, and if he's prepared to take direction, I'll hire him. I'll hire him. But if he comes in and starts giving me lip, I'll give him the door in 5 minutes. Do you know what I mean?
I don't expect that unless.
No. And you know, I'm thinking of one employer in Limerick in particular who would have chosen to employ people who had been in trouble and been in prison, and would have, you know, very deliberately chosen that in order to give people opportunities. But he also recognised that in terms of the business that he was in, that they had the knowledge and the skills that he was looking for, you know, in terms of what he was doing. And like, you know, he used to always say there's nothing like, you know, having the proven knowledge and skills to counter any kind of prejudice or bias that somebody might have against employing somebody, you know, and I think there's something in that as well.
There's great employers out there. There is, like, to be fair, and I've had some great opportunities. So has Timmy, you know. So as I said, I think we're moving into a new space, a more liberal Ireland, dare I say it. You know, so look, we're way over the time that we'd allotted. One thing I want to ask you before you go: if somebody wanted to be a probation officer, what's the route they can take?
Well, in the last couple of years, people are required to have a professional qualification in social work to become a social worker, to become a probation officer, and they must be registered with CORU, which are the kind of regulatory oversight group for social workers. So, you know, at the minute, that generally means an undergraduate degree, which is kind of 4 years, and a postgraduate qualification in social work then.
Okay. Because I know a lot of social work graduates and they kind of do their service in Tuxla or something, but the holy grail is always the probation for some reason. But I can see why it's an attractive job. So any would-be social workers, a lot of social workers watch the podcast. That's the route to do it.
That's
you know,
the route,
bide your time, build your experience like everything else. Anything you'd like to add before we finish?
Do you think we're far behind Scotland in terms of employing the probation service employing somebody that has been to prison? That has shown that they've turned a corner.
The system in Scotland is organised a bit differently in that it's the local authority employ social workers who are probation officers. You know, there isn't a kind of a national probation service in Scotland as there is in Ireland. I don't think we're there yet, Tim, if I'm to be absolutely honest with you. And like Alan is a very, very unique guy, you know, and I suppose the reason that we all know him is that there aren't too many Allans around the place, you know.
We still have a bit to go, don't we?
What
Margaret?
Service you look at. We do have a bit to go, We have a bit to go.
But look, we'll do our bit advocating on the podcast, and thanks a million for your time.
Thank you both. Thank you.
You did really well, and you represented your organisation very well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
To be fair to you. Thanks,
Thank
Tim.
you.
Thanks, lads.
Thanks, Rowan. And we'll see everybody next week. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you like what we do and want to contribute, consider donating a couple of euros, price of a cup of coffee for myself and Timmy, and a bar of chocolate for Rowan on the Patreon. And a haircut for Rowan as well. We're fundraising a haircut for Rowan. But head over to the Patreon and you can donate us a couple of euros, and it helps keep the show on the road. And thanks everybody, and we'll see you all again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.